You might remember a while ago, I built a boat. Now I know that's confusing because I've actually built a number of different boats, but I'm talking about the very first boat I ever built, the McKinsey River Style Drift Boat. It was a huge undertaking for me. At the time, I had never even come close to building anything that complex, and it still is probably my favorite build to date. But I had to do it in multiple parts. I think we did like 6 videos on that build. So we thought it would probably be helpful to you out there who might want to build your own boat to squish them all down into one condensed, easy to watch package. So that's exactly what we did. Another question we got all the time on that build is, hey, where'd you get the plans to build your boat? Well, we're gonna make sure to link exactly where I got my plans in the video description. So if you wanna build one, well, you can go check out the plans down there. I did not make them. I got them from somebody else. So go check the link and enjoy the show.
Ever since I was a little boy, I've been standing on riverbanks, staring out into the open water, watching people effortlessly float by, wishing that I was one of those people. Not standing on the bank observing, but out on the water, floating, without a care in the world. Some people spend their whole life wishing. I am not one of those people. I was bound to make this happen. So I headed out into the water, and floating was a little harder than I anticipated. In fact, it was really hard. I tried some various different methods to get myself going downriver, but in the end, it just was no good. If I really wanted to be out on the water, I was gonna have to figure out another way. An old pallet and an oar just wasn't gonna cut it. So I sat down and began to think, what could I do? Oh, I know. I could build my own boat. Yeah, let's do that. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I've never built a boat before. I know nothing about boats, and I know nothing about what I'm doing. So I got online and bought some plans. All 57 pages of them. I was pretty scared. I've never used plans before. I didn't know if I could do this. I was stressed out. I was worried. How could I use plans? I make stuff up as I go along. But then I decided to get over myself and get to work. The first thing the plan said to do was to cut out my hull panels. Now, I needed to cut these out from a 16-foot by 4-foot sheet of marine grade plywood. There's only one problem. You can't really get 16-foot sheets of plywood. So the first real step was to make a 16-foot sheet of plywood. Now, I found a place up in Washington where I could get marine grade Akume plywood, and they would CNC puzzle piece carve out the ends so that I could actually just glue them together and make my full 16-foot sheets. But it wasn't as simple as just gluing 2 8-foot sheets together. Because the CNC half-lap puzzle piece thingamabob overhangs into the sheet, in order to get 16 feet, I actually needed 3 4x8 sheets. So the first thing I had to do was cut down my 2 end pieces so that when I glued everything up, I would net a total of 16 feet. This is 1/4 inch ply, and that's what's recommended on the plans to make up the hull. So after cutting down both of my outside pieces, I moved my workbenches around to give myself a nice long work surface. Yes, underneath my workbench was disgusting, leave me alone. And I laid out the sheets on top in the direction that they needed to be glued up. Next, I created a little gluing surface. I found this old piece of butcher block just laying around in my shop, and I decided it was the perfect surface to join my 2 sides. So I coated the entire thing in wax paper, and then I mixed up some epoxy. To glue my sheets together, I'm using Total Boat's high performance epoxy. It's a 2-part mix with the hardener and the resin component. So after mixing everything up, I started coating my 2 joints thoroughly with a nice layer of epoxy, making sure to hit all my surfaces and get all my nooks, crannies, and edges. kind of like when I take a bath. Then after that, I simply, well, just hooked them together, just like a puzzle. Then I used a block and a hammer to tap everything into place, and I coated the top with a nice layer of wax paper to keep all of my clamping cauls from sticking to the plywood. That would be a mess, and I don't like messes. The nice thing about the whole CNC'd half-lap puzzle piece thing is they really do hook together like a puzzle piece, so I didn't need a whole lot of weight on them while they dried, but I threw a walnut and a couple oak clamping cauls down just to add a little extra weight, and then the next morning I came out and removed them to see how my seam turned out. And it turned out beautifully, I'm happy to report. I couldn't help but sand off the excess epoxy just to see how the whole thing was going to look. And, well, it looked like a puzzle pieced together piece of plywood, which is exactly what I was going for, so great. So with one seam done, I moved on to the other end, and I did my last seam to net my 16-foot sheet of plywood. While that was drying up, I decided to move over and start working on my transom. Now, if you don't know what a transom is, that's okay, neither did I. It's a nautical term for the back portion of a boat, where the two side walls or hull comes together and attaches to. So I made my transom, according to the plans, out of 3/4 inch marine grade ply. After drawing out the general shape, I cut out my beveled edges using the track saw, and then I braced the entire transom with ash. Fun fact, the entire ribbing and internal structure of this boat will be made in ash. This is also the first time I've ever used ash, so there's a lot of firsts for me on this one. Next, after finishing my transom, I needed to make my bow stem, another nautical term for the front portion of the boat, where the two side walls will attach at the front. So you got the transom in the back, bow stem at the front, and a boat in the middle. We hope. The transom was simply made out of a solid piece of 8/4 ash, cut on the table saw to have a 45-degree bevel on either side, with a little 1/4 inch strip in the middle that will make up the very front of the ship, or boat, or dinghy, whatever you want to call this thing. Do you ever get the feeling when you're working in your shop that you're being watched? I feel that way all the time. So with my transom and bow stem done, I unclamped the second seam on my side hull pieces, and just like that, I had made myself a 16-foot sheet of 1/4 inch Akume marine grade plywood that I could now use to cut out my hull panels. I also glued up a 14-foot piece of ply for the bottom of the boat, but we won't quite get to that in this video. Next, I had to cut out my hull panels. Now, it says in the plans to freehand this on the table saw. Freehand a 16-foot sheet of ply on the table saw. That just seemed dumb, so I wasn't going to do that. But I had a better idea. Instead, I got 2 pieces of rigid foam insulation from the big box store, and I just laid them down on my floor to make a nice cutting surface. Then I simply dropped my 16-foot sheet of ply onto that rigid foam insulation, and I mapped out my 2 hull pieces using a chalk line. Chalk lines are fun, but they're also kind of messy. And then I made what I like to call the monster track. I connected all of my track saw pieces together to make one giant 18-foot long piece of track, and I just cut out all the hull pieces with the track saw. I did not envy trying to run this 16-foot piece through the table saw freehand. Like I said, that just seemed dumb. And this worked great, so I was pretty happy. Then after I got my lengthwise cut, my cut long ways done, I trimmed down all the sides to start, well, making it look like a boat. Easy and nice, like a bowl of rice. I like to try and throw one catchphrase into all my videos, so that was the catchphrase for this video. And with that, my hull panels were cut to shape. The only thing left to do was to coat them in epoxy. Now, this is what it said to do in the plans, to coat each side in epoxy to add some rigidity and to also help waterproof the pieces. But it also said it was an optional step. That always confuses me. Should I do it or should I not do it? So I decided to be on the safe side and just go ahead and do it. So again, I started mixing up some Total Boat high performance epoxy, and I just started smearing it all over the place. It also said in the plans not to worry if this isn't perfect because you're going to sand it all down afterwards. So we're going to coat the whole thing in epoxy and then sand it all down. Great. It sounds like so much fun. Thanks, Boat Plans. You're really making me happy. But to be honest, it really wasn't too bad. And before long, I had the first side nicely coated in epoxy. So after that cured, I flipped them over, and yep, you guessed it, I coated the other side with epoxy. Like this. It's actually kind of fun. Feels like you're smearing around a booger. Then once both sides were cured, I just lightly sanded to get rid of all of the bumps and ridges and imperfection and dust and hair and, you know, all that jazz that lands on epoxy in the 8 hours or so it takes to cure. And just like that, my two side panels were done for now. And I was ready to start working on my rib pieces. With our hull panels all done and epoxied, it was time to start working on our rib construction. Now this is kind of a long process because, well, there's 9 ribs in total. They're all unique in size, shape, and angle. So I had to start by cutting all of my rough stock pieces with a bevel on the outside on the table saw. And then I had to freehand this diagonal cut that would make up my 2 outer pieces of each rib. This is a little sketchy cutting freehand at an angle on the table saw, but that's what the plan said to do, so I'm gonna do it. It also said not to worry about the cut not being perfect on the inside because it's on the inside and nothing's gonna attach to it, and heck, we'll clean that up later with the sander and all that jazz. Next, I had to lay out each individual rib to get the right angle, height, width, all that jazz. So I traced out each rib onto a template piece of MDF, paying very close attention to the plans because did I mention that every single rib is completely different? So there's not a lot of margin for error here. So with each rib, I first traced it out onto the template, and then I laid out the actual ash hardwood stock on top and aligned it perfectly with my traced lines. Then all I had to do was mark all my angles and cuts onto each piece, and then I took them over to the chop saw and I cut each compound angle over there. Then I brought them back over to my template, dropped them back in place, and double checked that everything lined up correctly and, well, looked like it was supposed to look. Which, to be honest, I don't know how it's supposed to look. I've never done this before, so I'm really flying off the seat of my pants right now. So I really hope this all comes together. And when I got one done, I did another one, this step, that step, over and over and over again, until before long I had what I hoped would be 9 perfect ribs. The last step was to take the base of each rib and cut a half circle into the bottom of each piece. These are actually my drain holes so that water can flow from the front to the back in the boat and all that fun stuff. And then I pre-sanded each piece because you know I love pre-sanding. Have I mentioned how much I actually hate sanding? Anyways, after sanding with a power sander, I just knocked all my edges and corners down by hand, and before long I had the rough pieces for 9 individual ribs, all unique and all hopefully going to make up the, inner workings of my boat. I'm at a loss for the correct terms with a lot of this stuff because, did I mention I've never done this before? I also feel like I keep saying the last step is when there is no last step. At least, I can't see a last step anytime soon. Anyways, next I hooked all the rib pieces together. Traditionally they are screwed together and glued together, so after pre-drilling with a countersink bit, I added a little 3M 5200 marine epoxy gooey stuff to each joint, and I added 3 1¼ inch screws. Now I'm only adding 3, not 4, because I'm actually going to be cutting a little notch in that bottom left hand corner on each rib piece. This is the chine notch. I know, I kind of sounded like I knew what I was talking about there, but I don't. The chine notch is this little notch where the chine sits in. A chine is a piece of wood that will internally connect all the ribs. I think. I don't know. But anyways, after getting all of my pieces screwed together, I started, having ribs for the boat. So I just kept going until all 9 of my rib pieces were complete. Screwing and gluing and gluing and screwing, until I got these things in this shape. And then I had to cut those chine notches that I was talking about. Now I'm sure there's a better way to do this, maybe on the table saw, but that seemed a little sketchy and I didn't want you guys to yell at me for being unsafe on the table saw. So I decided just to cut all the chine notches by hand. It took a little while, but it really wasn't that bad, and if you're careful with the pole saw, you can actually get a pretty nice, clean cut. I just cleaned them up a little bit with the chisel where they needed it, and before long I had all 9 of my ribs chined. All 9 chine 9. That kind of rhymes. And I couldn't help but lay them out on the floor just to get a general idea of the overall shape of the boat. Like I said, each rib is unique, and so they go, in and out and then back in again. Look, it's almost a boat. At this point, we're almost ready to start hooking this together. I know I said we're, it's just a habit. I'm going to. You're not helping. Believe me, I know you're not helping because I had to do the whole thing myself. But before we do that, we had to, see, I did it again. I had to mark out where all the ribs were going to land on my hull pieces. So let's review. We have our transom that will be the back. We have our bow stem that will be the front. We have our 2 side panels that will make up either side of the boat. And our ribs will connect everything in between. So the only thing left to do was to calm myself, take a deep breath, and just pray like crazy that this whole thing's gonna go together the way it should. I really have no clue the outcome. Let's just hope. So first I apply a liberal coating of that 5200 marine epoxy adhesive stuff, and I attach my first sidewall to the bow stem. Now I already pre-marked out a drill pattern to align all my screws, but once I get the side panel in place, I just tacked it with a few staples. These are just to hold it in place because I'm working alone and I didn't want it to move around while I pre-drilled all my holes with that countersink bit. Once all my holes were pre-drilled, I sank an insane amount of 1½ inch or 1 inch screws, I don't remember, into the bow stem to hold it in place. Just like that. Next, I had to attach the second sidewall piece. This was a little trickier because it had to be up at an angle, and like I said, I was working by myself, but nothing a few sawhorses and a chair won't accomplish. Again, I applied a liberal amount of that 5200 white gooey stuff, and after smearing it around with a putty knife, like I know what I'm doing, even though I don't, I position my second sidewall piece and I tack it in place. Again, just to keep it from moving while I get my screws and holes all drilled and such. Then I pre-drilled what seems like 5 million holes into my 1/4 inch sheet of ply, and I added my screws. I'm not gonna lie, this part was really satisfying. It just felt fun to sink all those screws in there. I don't use screws a lot, so I enjoy it when I get to. Then after all my screws were in place, it was time to move to the back of the boat and attach my transom. Believe it or not, I attached this in the exact same way. A little of that gooey white stuff. I tack it in place to keep it from moving. I drilled a few countersunk holes, and then I added all my screws. More screws. So many screws. These aren't actually going to be visible in the final product. This will all get trimmed out and covered up, but that's what the plans say to do, so I'm going with it. At this point, this is what the boat looks like. Attached in the front, attached on one side in the back. Next, I was supposed to attach my middle rib number 5, on one side. And then after it's attached on one side, I was supposed to bend the plywood around and attach it on the other side. So I'm just trying to follow instructions here. So I'm just doing what I'm told. Is it right? I don't know, but it is kind of starting to look like a boat. And just when I was getting going, wouldn't you believe it, the foreman stops by again, just to say hi. And he was pretty excited too. He wanted to climb in and take it for a ride. I tried to tell him it wasn't done yet, but he was convinced it would float. I wasn't so convinced. After attaching the rib on the second side, now it was finally time to attach the back and get the final shape of the boat. So I applied some more of that slimy stuff to the back, tacked it in place. You guys have seen this before. This is like, what, the 4th time I've done this exact same thing? And I screwed it in. Next, the plans say, I'm going to keep saying the plans say just so you can blame the plans and not me if some boat builder out there thinks I'm doing this wrong. Anyways, the plans say to hang the whole thing from the ceiling. This is supposed to make the boat kind of sag and take on its final shape and curve. So I hung it from the ceiling and then I just started throwing in all my ribs. This seems like a really complicated process, but it's actually pretty simple. All my ribs are already cut and beveled to the right angle to fit my hull, so I just stick them in, clamp them down, and I screw them in place according to my pre-marked lines on the outside of my hull. With each rib, I got just a little bit more excited. For 2 reasons, really. One, because my ribs were fitting the way they were supposed to, which I was really nervous about because, like I said, they're all unique and there's a lot of angles involved. But 2, because with each rib I installed, it was starting to look more and more like a boat. That was my goal, to build a boat. I didn't care what it looked like. As long as it floated better than that pallet, I was gonna be happy. And before long, I had all of my ribs installed, and I was well on my way. Well on my way to that free floating adventure I've longed for ever since I was, well, it was like, what, an hour ago when I was down by the river? Anyways, it was looking like a boat, and I was excited. I still have a long ways to go, but I'm happy with the progress thus far. I hope you'll come back and check out the next videos and see where this little project ends up. Hopefully the next time I float down the river, I don't get so wet.
Man, running a business is hard. I know you watch the videos and you see us having fun all the time, but I'm not gonna lie, sometimes it is incredibly stressful because we have so much going on, so much to do, and there are times that I just get overwhelmed and I think, you know what? It would probably be very helpful for my mental health to talk to somebody. And that's why the sponsor of today's video is so awesome. BetterHelp is aimed at connecting you with a licensed therapist that is there to help you talk through your problems and give unbiased advice. I feel like one of the big hurdles for me was just, where do I go to even find somebody to talk to? I mean, I knew that that would probably be beneficial, but it seemed like a huge hassle. That's why BetterHelp is so awesome, because you can just go to their website, you can use the link betterhelp.com/bourbonmoth, you answer a few questions, and then they're gonna pair you with a professional who has years of experience helping people work through their struggles, which is pretty awesome. I think we all have visions of therapy being going into somebody's office and laying down on a leather couch. But it doesn't have to be that. I mean, you can do it all from your phone or computer, whether it's a video call, phone call, even direct messaging. BetterHelp has a way that is going to be most comfortable for you. So if you've ever thought about talking to somebody, why don't you let our sponsor BetterHelp connect you with a therapist who's right for you. Just visit betterhelp.com/bourbonmoth and you're going to get a special discount off your first month. And the cool thing is you can do it all from the comfort of your own home.
I gotta keep working on the boat. So let's jump right in. Now, I thought I'd start off this video with showing you just how much of an idiot I am, because the first minute or so of this video is showing a terrible, horrible mistake. Now, the next step in the boat building process was to make chines. Chines are these long strips that run in between each rib. Now, I didn't have long enough pieces, so I had to make some. And being the moron I am, I thought I could just cut a small bevel on 2 pieces and glue them together with some epoxy. Like this. But, as I said, I'm a moron. But I didn't know that yet, so we'll just pretend like I know what I'm doing at this point. I glued them together with epoxy, took off my clamps, ran them through my planer, and I cut them to the appropriate shape that my chine needed to be. Don't mind that bulldozer, I was getting my driveway paved as I filmed this. At this point, stupid, naive Jason started trying to insert his chines into the chine notches in between each rib. And this is when I quickly realized that my method of gluing them together was, well, horrible. Did you see that? Did you see it just snap right there? Watch, I'll show you again. Plop. Just fell apart. You want to see it one more time? Here, I'll do it one more time. Snap! What an idiot. So I did what any woodworker would do at this point. I screamed at myself for a good few seconds, and then I decided there's got to be a way to do this. Correction, there's got to be a right way to do this. So I got on the good old internet and I looked up how to join pieces of wood together for boating applications. And I learned about a little something called the scarf joint. Now, a scarf joint is just a miter joint glued together, but the difference between a scarf joint and my stupid miter joint is that a scarf joint is extremely elongated, which gives you a much longer glue surface. So naturally, in order to cut this elongated scarf joint, I had to create a jig to cut a very elongated bevel miter thing on my boards. So after gluing 2 scrap pieces of plywood together, I squared it all out, first on the joiner and then the table saw, and then I had to cut basically a very long wedge that I could use as a template to cut my long scarf joint. So I took a piece of ply and I screwed it to my block of glued up plywood, and then using that as a reference, I was able to run this block through the table saw and cut a nice long wedge out of 2 pieces of 3/4 inch ply. Then I removed my little reference guide sheet thing and I drilled some holes into this scrap piece of ply. I know that seems weird, but it'll all make sense in just a second. I feel like I tell you guys that a lot. Maybe I should explain things better as I go. Anyways, I cleaned up my drilled holes with the chisel, and this allowed me to now clamp my stock piece of wood that I'd be using for my chines onto this handy dandy scarfing jig, and then run it through the table saw. Now the stock piece of wood will mimic the shape of my plywood template, and as you can see, it cuts a nice, long, smooth bevel onto that stock piece. This gives me about, I don't know, 10 times the glue surface that I was trying to work with before. And not only that, it's no longer end grain to end grain, so it's a much stronger joint. My second big mistake was how I was actually gluing it up. Now, being naive, dumb Jason, I thought just epoxy was fine, but it's not. So on my second attempt, after talking to some friends and doing some research, I did what's called wetting in the joint with regular epoxy, and then I made up some thickened epoxy using this crazy snow-like substance called colloidal silica. Colon silica. I don't know how to pronounce it, but basically it's like powdered glass that you add to the epoxy and make it nice and thick, and in doing so it actually makes the epoxy much stronger. So after mixing up a bunch until it was peanut butter consistency, I spread that on top of my already wettened joint with the regular epoxy, and I was finally ready to glue my scarves together. In order to make sure that my joint didn't slip at all, I stuck them together and then very carefully I applied a few push pins at the end of my joint just to keep it from slipping. No, this was not an original idea. It's something I learned in my stupid Jason research. That's what I like to call my research when I have to figure out how to do things the right way after I did them the wrong way. Anyways, after sticking the push pins in so my joint wouldn't slide, I also applied some clamps on either side of the joint, and this would keep it from moving the other direction. You know, just holding everything nice and secure. And then once I had those clamps applied, I just applied a zillion clamps to hold my joint firmly while it dried. And then I set it aside and I waited. Once my glue was dry, I took a block plane and I cleaned up the edges just to remove any excess epoxy. Yes, this probably was not good for my block plane blade, but I was willing to sacrifice it for the cause. With my joint all cleaned up and glued properly this time, I once again planed my material down to smooth up those joints and get it to the appropriate thickness. Then what seemed like the plot from Groundhog Day, I did everything I did before, but this time with properly glued wood. The pieces were so long I had to open up my shop door so that I could run them through the table saw. And then another thing I learned in my research is that before just shoving them in those chine notches, it's a good idea to clamp the pieces on the outside of the boat just to make sure that they're all going to bend the way they should bend and not snap. So after securely clamping the chines to the outside of the boat, I double-checked my scarf joint to make sure that it looked okay, and it looked fantastic. I may be an idiot, but I'm a teachable idiot. So now we're back to where the video started, but hopefully there will be no more mistakes from this point on. Knowing me, there probably will be. After confidently clamping my chine to the outside of the boat, I was ready to insert it into my chine notches. So first I had to cut a compound angle on one end that would perfectly meet up with the bow stem. Then I had to mark out a drill pattern on the outside of the boat so that I would know exactly where to place all 5 zillion of the screws that would hold the chine in place. And with that, I was ready to insert the chine. Man, I really love using all these boat terms. It just makes me feel so cool. Anyways, the chine insertion process, it can be a little tricky and fumbly, but you know, with a little hitting there and banging here, I was able to get my chine inserted. Now, what the plans say to do is just to start at the bow and then slowly work your way to the back, inserting the chine into the notches as you go. So I got it all clamped securely on the front. I pre-drilled with a countersink bit, and then I just started throwing screws in there. I also clamped a clamp directly onto the chine that I could use just to leverage the chine into the right angle as I screwed and drilled it into place. And it worked great. Here's where I made my second big mistake. I know I said I hoped there wouldn't be any more, but alas, I am only human, and I've never built a boat before. The plans say that when you get to the transom, you need to transfer the angle of the transom onto the chine so that you can cut it to that angle and slip it in so that it is perfectly flush and tight against the transom. But being an idiot, like I've said before, I did not account for the compoundness of the angle. So after transferring the mark from my transom, I inserted my chine only to find out that I cut it a good ½ inch short of the transom.
Boo!
Gosh, that hurts. But my chine was fully installed at this point and there wasn't a whole lot I could do about it. So I decided to put that mistake behind me, move on to my second chine, and like most things in my life, I'll just worry about that later. So I installed the check-in sign. Nope, that's not right. I installed the second chine the exact same way I installed the first, starting at the bow and just working my way back towards that bloody transom that I knew was waiting with a previous mistake. So here's where I did something either really smart or really dumb. I figured since I cut the other chine improperly, I might as well do the same thing to this one, so at least they'd match. I mean, if you're gonna make a mistake, you might as well just go with it and make people think that you didn't make a mistake. At least that was my plan here. So I cut the other chine a ½ inch short so that it would match on both sides. And I was starting to compile a solution for this problem. I just really didn't want to have to deal with it. I decided that instead of just trying to shove a little block in there that would probably be noticeable and obvious that I made a mistake, I would do the opposite and shove a giant block in there. But I kind of made it decorative. I rounded it over on one side to dive into the back of the transom and made sure the angles were cut perfectly to fit the side and back of the boat. And to tell you the truth, if you didn't know it wasn't supposed to be there, you'd probably never even be able to tell that I messed up. At least that's what I keep telling myself. But anyways, with my oopsie blocks installed, it was time to move on to the bottom. With our chines all installed, it was time to start prepping the boat to place the bottom on it. The bottom, not my bottom. This involved doing a lot of hand planing around the chine and plywood surface. I had to bring down that plywood so that it evenly matched the chine. So after hand planing, I sanded and sanded some more. Then finally, I took a straight edge and I laid it across each of the ribs just to make sure that it was perfectly flush from left to right. And with a little adjustment, my bottom was ready to be set on that boat. Now this was a bit awkward. This is a 14-foot ½ inch sheet of ply, and struggling to get it on that boat was not the most enjoyable task, but in the end I got it in place. Now it says in the plans you need 2 to 3 other people. 2 to 3 other people. I'm so sick of it saying that. I'm all by myself, plans. Jeez. But who needs 2 to 3 other people when you have some ratchet straps and a drill? So I used a ratchet strap to pull down the front of the boat, and I did the exact same thing to pull down the back of the boat. It actually worked really well. I mean, I think I'm going to rewrite these plans that say, here's how you build a boat all on your lonesome, because, well, I'm all alone. Really, alone. With my bottom ratchet strapped into place, that's funny, I traced out the shape of the boat onto the sheet of plywood. Then I removed all my ratchet straps, took the bottom back off the boat, and just using a jigsaw, I cut out the rough shape of my boat bottom. I wasn't being too careful at this point because there will be a slight overhang on the bottom that we'll clean up later. Before placing the bottom onto the boat, I went around with some 3M 5200 sealant epoxy compound gunk, and I applied it to every single surface that the bottom would come in contact with. This will act both as a glue and a sealant to keep water from passing in or out of the boat. And remember when I was glorifying myself, saying how you could do all this by yourself? Yeah, I decided it wasn't a great idea to put the bottom on by myself. After applying all that glue, the last thing I wanted was to smear it all over the place trying to get the bottom on. So I called up my neighbor Brad. He's a great friend. he'll not even ask questions when you call him up in the middle of the night and ask him to come help you with your bottom. He was very relieved to realize it was the boat bottom, though. Next, I had to figure out a way to find my chines underneath my bottom. So I made this fancy little jig here. Now, it might look a little funny, but it works great. Basically, you can run the jig along the side of the boat, and the point on the top tells you exactly where the middle of the chine is. So using my homemade little jig, I transferred a line onto the bottom of the boat, and this gave me the appropriate place to add all of my screws. Next, using a ruler, I spaced out a predetermined drill pattern, and I pre-drilled all of my screw holes, followed up by adding what seemed like 1,000,000 screws to the bottom of the boat. It seems a little ironic to put a bottom on a boat and then drill a bunch of holes in it, but the plans said to do it, so I'll blame them if anything goes wrong. So while Brad firmly held my bottom, I sunk in all the screws. Lost my train of thought. Then we had to mark out where all the ribs landed so we could add screws to those, making sure not to put any screws in my pre-drilled drain holes. That wouldn't be good. So with everything marked, I again drilled 500 holes in the bottom of my boat. Man, I hope this doesn't come back to bite me. But, well, you only live once. With my bottom securely fastened, I cleaned up the entire edge, first with the sander, then with the block plane, and then I sanded it just a little bit more until the entire bottom was nice and flush with the side walls of the boat. Now, you would think, based on my previous mistakes, that I'm crazy for this next part, but here's where I decided to go rogue and ignore the plans. Now, the plans wanted you to leave the bow of the boat just like this. Exposed screws, exposed plywood, and I don't know if it's my furniture background, but I just couldn't bring myself to leave any exposed screws on the outside of this boat. So I decided to make a little nose cap to go over the front of the boat and hide up all of my screws. Now, I thought about how to do this for a while and finally determined that I was going to make it out of 3 separate pieces. Problem was, these are 3 pieces, all cut at different angles, and clamping them together was going to be a nightmare. I mean, look at me. I can barely even hold them together the right way, let alone clamp them. So I scratched my head, I thought, I pondered, I ate some food, and then I came back and thought some more. And that's when I had an idea. I thought I figured out a way to do this. Hopefully this will work. So the first thing I did was tape a piece of wax paper to the front of the boat. I know, just go with me on this. And then I took my centerpiece and I perfectly aligned it onto the bow, and then using a 23 gauge nailer, I just nailed it to the front of the boat. I promise I have a plan. Seriously, I think this will work. Just believe me here. My thought process was that by tacking it with a 23 gauge nailer, that would hold it secure while I clamped my other pieces on, and then I could just pull the whole thing off after the glue dries. But I still had the issue of not having anything to hook my clamps to on those outer 2 pieces. So I cut a few clamping cauls with an angle on them that was basically the opposite of the angle I was clamping. And I glued each caul firmly in place onto my outer pieces with some CA glue and some accelerator spray. I had purposely made my outer pieces thicker than they needed to be so that I wouldn't have to worry about my clamping cauls marring up that outer surface. So after gluing those clamping cauls in place, I decided to test and see if I could get a nice secure clamp onto that middle piece. And wouldn't you know it, every once in a while I do something that actually works. So learning from my past gluing mistake, I decided to not just glue this together with epoxy. I was going to go the same route that I used for my scarf joints, and so I wet in the entire edge with some thinned epoxy, and then added some more of that coal and glass stuff to thicken the epoxy, and applied the thickened epoxy over the already wet in surface of my middle piece. Then all I had to do was apply my 2 outer pieces, hook some clamps in place, and, well, just let it sit and do its thing. As you can see, if you look really close, you can kind of determine the shape I'm going for on the inside there. So after letting it sit for a good 24 hours, I removed my clamps and prayed like crazy that this thing would easily pop off. And just like that, it came right off. I pulled out those 23 gauge nails, and I was ready to start shaping my made up nose cone thing into the end result. So using the table saw, I just trimmed off those clamping cauls rather than try and break them off, and I was left with a nice smooth surface. Then I took it over to the drum sander and removed the majority of the excess material on the front with the drum sander to bring it down to its almost final shape, like this. And then finally I cleaned up the entire thing just with the hand sander until it was nice and smooth, and I was really thinking this is gonna work, just like this. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't avoid putting any screws in the front of the ship, but I decided if I was going to insert screws, I was going to do it in a way that I could easily plug them and make them almost disappear. So after prepping the piece for plugs, I applied an insane amount of 3M 5200 to the back of my little nose piece, and I stuck it on there. Then after clamping it to hold it securely, I inserted a few screws. And that's all I have to say about that. As far as I could tell, my nose cap piece was a huge success, and so with that, it was time to move to the back of the boat and start trimming out my transom. My transom was simply trimmed out with 3 pieces of ash, cut to mimic the bottom and sides of the boat, held in place with a few screws that I also prepped for plugging later, and some more 3M 5200. I wiped each piece down in between application with some acetone to remove the excess sealant, and then using a flush cut saw, I trimmed off all the extra little bits to make it look nice and pretty. We like pretty. For now, I'm just applying the trim to the back of the boat, but don't you worry your little face. I will eventually apply a second piece of trim to the side to cover up those ugly screws you can see. With my transom all trimmed out, it was time to cut and install my chine battens. Now the chine battens are simply a piece of trim that will cover up the millions of screws I use to install the chine through the outside of the boat. So after applying more 5200 to the outside of the boat, I again called my good friend Brad. I'm getting kind of used to having help. Man, a guy could get spoiled with neighbors like that. And after applying more 5200 to the chine itself, Brad held one end while I positioned the chine batten into place. Now I designed that front nose piece so that the chine batten sat just behind that front piece. I thought it gave it a nice profile and look, and I'll trim down that whole top portion when I'm done. Did you hear me? I screwed my chine battens in place working to the back transom, and then I flush cut those even with the transom itself. And then after doing one side, I hopped over and did the exact same thing to, well, the other side. And then, you guys are gonna think this is so crazy, I added a bunch more screws. Because that's basically all building a boat is just installing a crazy amount of screws. With my second batten screwed on and trimmed flush with the transom, I wiped down all my seams with an acetone soaked rag to remove any excess 5200. And then, remember when I said I just hated exposed screws? Well, this is where that comes back to bite me. Not in the way that I made a mistake, it's just I forced myself to make about 300 ash plugs to hide all of my screw holes. So after making a zillion plugs, I used epoxy inside each pre-drilled hole, and then I added my plugs. I gotta tell you, this was probably the most satisfying step on the boat so far. I mean, sure, it was fun to see it take shape and look like a boat and blah 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 blah, but I just love covering up ugly screws, I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, I like it. Except when this happens. That I do not like so much. No. While I waited for the epoxy on all my plugs to dry, I just couldn't help myself. I had to trim this nose cap flush so that it didn't look so bulky and awkward. So, well, it's my boat, I can do what I want, so I did it. Then the only thing I like more than covering up ugly screws is flush cutting plugs. I mean, how could you not like this part? And fortunately for me, I had a crazy amount of plugs to flush cut. But I loved every minute of it. Then after flush cutting them all, I even enjoyed sanding them smooth. One of the few times I really enjoy sanding, because man, doesn't that clean up nice. So after sanding all of my cut plugs to just make it pretty, I finally got to do something that I have yet to do on this build so far, and that was to flip the boat over to its right up direction. Is that how you say that? Its upright direction, and finally get my first look at what this boat is properly gonna look like. I mean, kind of look like. I still got a lot of flipping work to do, but you can actually tell it's a boat now, which is cool. Next, I will have to work on my handrails, exterior paint, internal seats, and all that fun stuff, but we're out of time for this video, so you'll have to stay tuned for the next.
A cold mist rolls in. Port bow! Port bow! Mermaid off the port bow! Oh jeez! It's a nor'eastern! Hold on! Hold on! Woo! Iceberg! Iceberg! Right ahead! Hey, somebody? There's an iceberg up there. What was that? What was that?
Must be careful. Don't want to wind up in Davy Jones's locker.
Is it Davy Jones or Danny Jones? Davy?
Davy Jones's locker.
Anchors away, my dears. Anchors away. Red skies this morning. We must be on the lookout. Move the giblet crank and wax the mollies. Top notch, easterly bound.
What? Can a guy practice?
All right, ready? And go. From the moment I inserted my ribs into the plywood frame, I had really wanted to trim down my ribs. But I couldn't do that until I got my interior and exterior handrails in place. So I started out by milling down some long pieces of wood that I had glued up in my previous scarfing adventure in the last video. And I first just clamped it to the side of the boat to make sure it would bend. But I needed to cut some angles to make sure that it, fit nicely against my bow stem cover thing. So I took a scrap piece that was the same dimension, roughly, as my handrail, and just clamping it to the side, I transferred the angle of my bow stem onto this scrap piece of wood and cut it on the miter saw, just to make sure I had my angle exactly right before I cut my actual handrail piece. Ah, yeah, I like the looks of that. Once I was sure I had my angle just right, I added a roundover to two sides of my exterior handrail. You could also call this a gunnel or a gun wall, but the plans say handrail, so I will be referring to it as a handrail. Then I took it over to my contractor miter saw and I cut the final angle. I had to use this saw because the piece was so long it wouldn't fit on my normal miter station. Next, I needed to glue the handrail onto the outside of the boat. Learning from my past mistakes with gluing, I first wet in the piece with some thinned down epoxy, and then I made some thickened epoxy with that colloidal silica, that powder stuff, and I put it on top of the thinned down epoxy. Then just very carefully and slowly, I started at the bow of the boat, making sure my angle was nice and tight against that bow stem cover, and I just started adding clamps, slowly working my way along the exterior of the boat until I had the entire outside handrail clamped just below the plywood. I wanted it just below the plywood because I can easily sand through the plywood to bring it flush with that exterior handrail. Then I cleaned up the entire thing with an acetone soaked rag just to get rid of any of that pesky epoxy squeeze out. And after waiting a good 4 or 5 hours, I removed all of my clamps and it was glued nice and securely to the exterior of my boat. I then did the exact same thing on the other side. Why didn't I just do both of them at the same time, you ask? Well, believe it or not, boat building is the one time that I found myself without enough clamps. I had to put so many flippin' clamps on the outside of this thing that I just couldn't do both sides at the same time. So after I finished one side, I took all the clamps I used on that side and moved over to the other side. See, that's a crazy amount of clamps. There's one every 2 inches. So yeah, a lot of clamps. Then after letting that side sit overnight, I came out the next morning and removed all of those clamps. There's a lot of them, so I just sped up the video so you wouldn't get bored. Then, because my handrail overhung the back transom, I took a Japanese pull saw and I cut it flush with the trimmed out back transom. And it looked oh so nice and clean. And then I did the same thing to the other side. With my exterior handrails complete, it was time to move on to my interior handrails. Now these are going to be done in pretty much the same way, with a few exceptions. I had to add a few wedge blocks to the bow and stern of the boat for the handrail to terminate into the transom and bow stem. So of course it was back over to the Total Boat epoxy to wet in the pieces with thinned epoxy and then apply more thickened epoxy. Then I simply clamped my transom wedges in place and waited for them to dry. And then, believe it or not, I clamped my bow wedges in place. And hey, look who I found lurking, the foreman. But he was pretty happy with my work, so I shall continue. One last wedge piece and I will be ready to install my internal handrails. Since I had a little free time waiting for my wedge blocks to dry, I decided to add the last piece of exterior trim to the transom portion of the boat and cover up the remaining visible screws. Now I just did this really easy. I just used thickened epoxy and a 23 gauge nailer to hold the piece in place while the epoxy dried. Oh my gosh, this guy, just trying to steal the show. And also while I waited for those wedge blocks to dry, I took the time to fill the exterior screw holes on the outside panel with a little thickened epoxy mixed with sawdust. This will all get sanded down and painted, and hopefully you'll never even know those screws were there. But before I could actually install the interior handrail, I needed to get all my angles correct. Now this was far trickier than the exterior, because not only did I have the angle at the bow to worry about, I also had to tuck it in by the transom, so there was going to be another angle at the back as well. So again, just using a scrap piece that matched the dimension of my interior handrail, I figured out my angle before cutting it onto my actual piece. Now, like I said, the interior handrail is a little tricky because not only is there an angle at the front and the back, I had to make sure that I cut it at the exact right length so that, it fit nicely and tight. I did not know what to do, so I decided just to purposely cut it long and then slowly just trim it down, fit it, trim it down, fit it, trim it down, fit it, until I got it just right. Remember, I had that nasty mistake installing my chines in the last video, and I did not want to repeat it with another piece that was cut too short. So after cutting my interior handrail roughly to length, I clamped it in place and tried to determine how much needed to be removed. And then I took it over to my contractor saw, trimmed off just a little bit, and then I put it back in. And I did this 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 20 times until it was nice and snug and perfectly fit from my bow to my stern. And the nice thing about boat building is it's the same on both sides, so once you get one thing figured out, usually the other side goes a little bit quicker. But it didn't. I still had to do it about 20 times until it was just right. And with that, it was time to glue it in place. So I removed my clamps, took out the interior handrail, and again I added a nice round over to the entire thing, because you know how I like to round over things. Next, I applied just a dab of thickened epoxy to each rib where the handrail would land, as well as to my transom wedges and my bow wedges. And then very carefully, I maneuvered that handrail into place and slowly just clamped it down. This is where I kind of learned that things don't want to stay where they want to stay when they're under a lot of tension, because it kept popping out at the bow of the boat. And you'd think I would have learned my lesson and started clamping there and then worked my way the other direction, but no, I just kept letting it pop out until finally I got smart and just left it out until I worked my way up to the bow. And that worked much, much better. The one nice thing with the interior handrails as opposed to the exterior is that because I only needed a clamp on each rib and the wedges, I actually had enough clamps to do both sides at the same time. So after doing one side, I moved over and did the other side, flawlessly I might add, because I learned all those mistakes from the first side. See, look at me, I'm wonderful. And then, just like before, I took an acetone soaked rag and I cleaned up all the squeeze out. Next, I had to add my lag bolts that would go through each rib and hold that interior handrail securely in place. So after drilling a hole, I inserted my bolt with a decorative washer, to make it look all pretty. And I just repeated this step on every single rib. My drill bit was getting kind of hot and smoking, but kind of looks cool, right? Dun 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 dun. Anyways, I drilled all those holes, inserted all my lag bolts, and added a nut to the inside. This nut's really just temporary. These will all eventually get cut off and a cap nut will be put in place. I also couldn't find a wrench, so like a true woodworker, I just used a pair of pliers. Because that's the way we do things in a wood shop. Now, I was ready for the part I had been waiting for forever. Trimming those ribs flush. If I thought flush cutting the plugs was satisfying, I was sadly mistaken. This by far was the most satisfying part of the entire build. Oh man, doesn't that just clean it up nicely? I could be biased, but I think it looks pretty darn good. And then I moved over to the other side, drilled all my holes, inserted all my lag bolts, added my nuts. Hey, look, I found a wrench. What a smart guy. He can be taught. And then I flush cut all the ribs on that side. Boom, 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 boom. Bazinga! Wacha! Wah! Beautiful. Nice and clean. Yep, that's my muscle. Then to keep the satisfaction ship sailing, I was able to flush cut my transom. This is a little trickier because it was a bigger piece, but I just took my time and boom, it was nice and clean. First I did one side, then I did the other. This will get touched up just with a little bit of sanding, but ultimately this will be the final shape of the transom. And if I can say so, this boat's gonna have a nice rear end. With the transom flush cut, the last thing to flush cut was the actual bow itself. Now this was a little bit trickier. It was a very thick piece. I had to come in at a weird angle, and you know, it wasn't perfect. But with a little sanding and shaping, I got it looking quite nice. Oh yeah. Sorry, there's a lot of awkward sexuality in this video apparently. With my transom and bow cut flush, I sanded down all of my handrails to bring them perfectly even with that piece of plywood. And next, using just a trim router, I added a nice 1/4 inch roundover on each interior space between the exterior and interior handrail. Because, you know me, I love a good roundover. Then after roundovering enough to get my roundover fix, I hand sanded each little piece just to get rid of any chatter or burn marks, and voila. With that, the exterior of my boat is completely constructed. So let's move on to the interior. Now the interior is going to consist of 2 seats, an oarsman's seat and a passenger seat, as well as a front little bow shelf with knee guards that you can stand up and brace your knees against while you fish. I won't quite get to the knee guard in this video, but I will show you the installation of the 2 seats. First, I needed to work on my front passenger seat. Now this seat is a little unique because it's not a fixed seat. It's actually going to slide forward and backwards, allowing you to trim out the weight in the boat depending on how many passengers are riding with you. So the first thing I had to do was install some brackets that would hold a 1/2 inch piece of galvanized pipe that my seat will be hung on, allowing it to slide forward and aft, I guess would be the correct term. So after installing my brackets, I then cut my piece of galvanized pipe. Ah, close-up spark shot. Now I'm a real YouTuber. And then I fit that piece of 1/2 inch galvanized pipe between my 2 brackets. Now my front bracket is solid ash and gets glued and screwed directly to the rib. My back bracket is 3/4 inch marine grade plywood and it will get bolted to the rib. This allows me to remove it, thus removing the pipe and seat if I should ever want to in the future. So after fitting my bracket in place, I drilled through the bracket and through the rib and installed it with some more lag bolts and decorative washers. Then I did the exact same thing over on the other side until my pipe was fit securely in place. Next, I cut the rails that would make up the framework for my seat. As you can see, they just set right on top of that piece of pipe, and once I frame out the seat, they will be able to slide both front to back. I mean, forward and backwards. What's the word again? Aft. Forward and aft. So with my rails cut to the proper length and sliding smoothly, I cut some more pieces of wood and, you know, glued and screwed them together. Because that's the theme in this whole boat. Just gluing and screwing stuff together. I am going to plug all these holes though, because you know how I hate screws. And then I tested to see if the framed out seat would fit. And it does. Now this is where I went a little rogue, because the plans say just to slap a piece of plywood on the top and call it quits, but I can never call anything quits. I thought there was an opportunity here to do something a little cooler. So with a little thinking and work, I added a piece of plywood to the top that had cup holders in it. It also had this lift-up storage compartment, and I also made these cool seat backs that are removable but can slide in to give your passengers a more comfortable and luxurious ride. You know, you don't want your passengers to be uncomfortable while they're sitting for hours in a boat on the cold open water. And then I constructed my rear oarsman's seat. This is a much simpler seat to construct because it doesn't have to move. It just gets bolted in between rib number 3 and 4. Not that that means anything to you, but that's what the plan said, so that's why I'm telling you right now. It'll also eventually get a woven rope seat, woven back and forth here across those 1/2-inch galvanized pipes, and be a nice comfy place for me to sit and row the boat. And with that, I know I say this all the time, but it is really starting to look like a boat. I literally have 2 more things to build on this project: the floorboards and that front knee brace guard thing, mabobber. But alas, we are out of time for this video, so that will have to wait for another video. Probably the final video. You guys, I'm almost done with this thing.
I finished the boat! I finished the boat! Woo! I finished the boat! I finished the boat. Let me show you.
The next thing I had to do was figure out all my internal floorboards. Now the floorboards, like everything in this boat so far, are not square. They are cut on a taper. So I made this quick and easy tapering jig for my table saw with just a piece of plywood and some little hold down clamps. I stuck a piece of rift sawn ash in my tapering jig, and you guessed it, I started running it through the table saw. First I ran it through on one side to get a nice taper following my pre-drawn line, and then as soon as I was done with that, I ran it through on the other side. And I repeated this step on a number of boards until I had the amount that I needed for the floorboards. Then I hooked the floorboards together with a few brace pieces so that I could make a floorboard structure that could be easily removed if I ever need to replace them or maintain them with more oiling or general maintenance on the boat. Once I securely put it in the boat and made sure that it fit right where I wanted it to, I climbed inside the boat. Now this isn't just to look cool. I needed to climb inside the boat so that I could weigh down the boards so that they could bend to form to the bottom of the boat. Once they were bent in place by my enormous amount of weight, I pre-drilled and screwed them directly into the ribs, holding them firm and secure. After screwing them into one row of ribs, I moved to the back and screwed them into another set of ribs. Really not that exciting, just trying to show you the process here. Just stick with me. After doing the front floorboard section, I repeated this step on the back floorboard section. Now you'll notice there's a gap missing in the middle there where there is no floorboards. That gap is right in front of the oarsman's seat and is purposely left out so that when you're sitting rowing the boat, you've got plenty of leg room to dangle your little footsies. Again, I climbed inside the boat, and using my holiday weight, I bent the boards down to form to the bottom, and I firmly secured them to the rib. Once that was done, it was time to move to my fly decking. Now it's called a fly deck because as you stand at the front of the boat and fly fish, this deck is meant to catch all of the extra line that you pull out of your reel while fishing. I made it simply with a piece of 1/4-inch ply that fit perfectly to the front of my boat, and then I made this front brace piece out of ash with these convenient knee locks. What are knee locks, you ask? Well, they're places that you can lock your knees while you stand up and fish, so you don't tip over. Heh, pretty genius, huh? With my fly decking complete, according to the plans, I was all done with the boat. It had nothing else I needed to build, but because I just can't stop myself from adding on, I decided to add a little shelf or seat at the back of the boat. I figured this would be a great place for an extra passenger or to strap a cooler or your children when they're misbehaving. So I quickly threw together this little bench seat thing. Again, just using the taper jig on the table saw and a few pieces of ash for braces. I lined everything up, spaced it out evenly, and I secured it with some stainless steel screws and decorative washers. I don't know, I think it's a nice addition, if I do say so myself. There were just a few more little things that needed to be added. The next was the rub strip that needed to be attached to the outside of the boat. Blah, 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 ha ha. Gosh, that guy's annoying. I cut this out of a piece of 1/4-inch ply using the... Okay, we get it, jeez. 1/4-inch ply using the track saw to get my overall shape. It was quick and easy, and before long, I had 2 identical rub strips that I could... Oh my gosh, this dude. 2 identical rub strips that I could attach to the outside of the boat. The idea behind these is just to add a little more strength to your hull in its most vulnerable spot, where it is most likely to come in contact with rocks and other debris floating in the river. I attached it with some thickened epoxy and screwed it firmly into each rib. And last but not least, I decided to give my boat COVID-19. And by that I mean insert the oar blocks. These are the oar blocks that hold the oar locks. So I inserted the small piece of ash between the outside gunnel and interior handrail, and then I held it securely in place with some more bolts and decorative washers. Then I inserted the brass oar lock. I lost count of how many DMs and comments I got from people concerned about these bolts sticking out. Are you going to cut off the bolts? Are you going to leave the bolts hanging out like that? Of course I'm not. It was always my intention to cut them down. I just wanted to save it to the end because it was really satisfying. It was like my dessert after dinner. So I cut them all with a sawzall. Then I took off the temporary little nut that rethreaded the bolt, and then I secured a nice little acorn cap nut. There. Are you happy? I hope you can all sleep soundly knowing those are taken care of. And with those little caps, the boat was completely constructed. 100% built. There wasn't a thing left that I could add to this boat without going way off plans. Believe me, I had thoughts about rocket launchers. I had thoughts about underwater submersible submarines that could be deployed from the transom, but alas, I decided to call it quits. Now that it was completely put together, there was only one thing left to do, and that was to take it all apart. Everything that I had spent the last few days carefully and meticulously installing needed to be pulled out piece by piece so that I could start the long and painfully boring finishing process. I'm just joking. I'm actually really excited to put finish on this thing. I mean, look at it. It's just begging for a good oiling. Still thinking about when I oiled that Lego man, and I've really wanted to oil something up since. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. So I removed the front fly deck, I removed my rear shelf, I removed the seats and the pipe brackets, and then last I removed the floorboards. Back to where we started at the beginning of this video. Seems like we've made very little progress. But you've got to go back before you can go forward, as all great boaters say. Maybe. I don't really know the boat terms yet. With the boat completely disassembled and ready to start the finishing process, I first needed to flip it over so I could finish the bottom. So I called my friend Justin, aka Rainfall Projects. He has his own YouTube channel that if you're not subscribed to, well, you're just a flippin' idiot. There, I said it. So go check out his page. He literally ran over. I said, hey, can you run over? He said, sure, I'll run over. So he got in jogging shorts and ran the 3 miles from his house to mine. And then after flipping the boat, he promptly left. What a weirdo. With the boat flipped over, I could start the finishing process on the bottom. After filling all my screw holes to make the bottom nice and smooth, I created a nice border of tuck tape to create a dam so that when I poured epoxy on the bottom, well, obviously I didn't want it to run all over the place. To coat the bottom, I'm using this, Coat It. Yep, that's what it's called, Coat It. It's a high-strength 2-part epoxy that's mixed with both Kevlar and graphite. The Kevlar makes it crazy strong, and the graphite makes it crazy slippery. I guess you want the bottom of a boat to be slippery so it can glide easily through the water and across rocks and all that jazz. Now the plan said to just use one can and do one nice thick coat on the bottom. So that's what I did. I mixed the can up and I smeared it around, just like cream cheese smeared on an old lady's face, until it was nice and smooth. And then I let it dry and I looked at it and I decided, I think maybe I'll do one more coat. I mean, what's it gonna hurt? A thicker bottom's better than a thin bottom. At least that's what I tell myself. So with my tuck tape dam still in place, I smeared another coat of Coat It, creating a super thick, super strong, impenetrable fortress across the bottom of my vessel. Once it was dry, about 24 hours later, I removed all the tape to reveal a beautiful seam. Actually, it looked really terrible, but I just hit it with the sander and it smoothed out and blended into my chine very nicely. Maybe even a little too nice. With my bottom coated in the gooey stuff, yeah, I just heard it as I said it. Anyways, my bottom was done. I taped off all of my exterior trim pieces and coated it in a nice thick coat of Total Boat's wood varnish sealer primer stuff. And then after that was dry, I coated it in no less than about 8 coats of Total Boat varnish. Now, I was only varnishing my exterior bottom trim, back transom trim, and front bow stem. The handrail and the entire interior of the boat will get oiled. Once I got all the varnish on and it was nice and dry, I very carefully removed all the tape, and then I put more tape back on, this time over all of the trim pieces. To prepare for paint, silly. The first step in the painting process was this, Total Boat's topside primer. This would create a nice base layer for me to put on the Total Boat Wet Edge. It's a special boat paint that does all sorts of fancy things. You can read it on the label, but it's really good stuff. Oh my goodness. It's the foreman. He's not even looking at me. If you're gonna come out, at least check on my work. Don't just stare into the weird orb facing your dad. Anyways, I got a nice layer of primer on the entire boat. Now, Total Boat sells pretty stock boat colors, but I didn't want a stock color. So I just bought a bunch of different colors that they offer, and I kept mixing them together until I got a color I did like, which was this. More of a, no, not that. That's the brush thinner that I added to the paint. The color, more of a Stanley Thermos green. I like it. I hope you do as well. And I started applying the paint using a method called rolling and tipping. It's a method I learned from watching some other boat builders' videos. Basically, you roll on very thin layers in small sections, and then you tip it, meaning you run the tip of your paintbrush over the top after rolling. This smooths out the paint, and then because the paint is specially designed to self-level, it levels out, removing all of your brush strokes and giving you, no joke, an almost perfect spray-like finish. I had my doubts, but it went on like glass. The next day, I sanded it down with a little 320 and applied the second coat of paint. In all, I put 3 coats of paint on top of the primer. To be honest, I probably could have got away with just 2. It looked great after 2, but you know how I like to add extra layers to things, so After 2, I danced first. You always got to dance a little bit. And then after dancing, I added a 3rd layer of paint. I guess that's all I have to say about painting. While I waited for the paint to dry, I began the process that I had been putting off for a long time, and that was sanding all of those interior pieces down to get ready for finish. So I sanded and screen printed? What? I did have this crazy idea through the sanding process about screen printing my logo onto the front fly deck. I had my doubts on whether or not it would work, but the screen printing ink is basically just paint, and voila, a custom screen printed logo on my fly deck. And then it was back to sanding. If you've watched any of my videos, you know I love sanding. So let's talk about something else. A while ago, a follower of mine sent me this letter along with this piece of wood. Basically, the letter says that his grandfather worked at the USS Constitution Museum in Boston, Old Ironsides, and they were restoring it at one point and had to replace some of the fur decking. He managed to secure a piece of that decking and he sent it to me, thinking it would be a good addition to work into my boat. You heard me correctly. A subscriber of mine sent me a piece of a boat that was commissioned by the first president of the United States, George Washington. It may be a little piece, but it was a piece of the decking, and after commissioning the ship, George Washington held a commissioning ceremony on the vessel where he gave a speech, meaning that George Washington himself could have stood on this very piece of wood that will now reside in the front of my boat in between the knee locks. So I raise my glass. This one's for you, George. I hope that my building of this vessel has done you proud. I hope that one day as I float gloriously down a river, free from tyranny and strife, that I can tell my son about old George Washington, whose teeth were as wooden as this here boat, and how he was the first president to this great and glorious nation. With everything sanded and all historical artifacts securely fastened, it was time to start getting some oil on this thing. First, I started by oiling all those small internal pieces. There was a lot of them. I coated them in not 1, not 2, but 4 coats of teak oil. I pretty much just kept rubbing the oil on until it just stopped soaking it in, and then I let it sit for a day and rubbed some more on. I wanted to make sure it was nice and oiled up. I mean, you guys know how I like to rub oil on things. After doing all the small internal pieces, I removed all the tape from my paint that was now nice and dry, and then it was time to flip the boat back over for the last time in this finishing process and rub oil on the inside. I didn't call Justin again, I actually just called Brad back. Remember Brad? Yeah, he smelled a lot better than Justin. Justin smelled like he'd been running miles. Anyways, Brad helped me lower the boat to the floor, and then very, very carefully, as not to scratch up the paint, we tipped it on its side, did a little scoot and shuffle, pretty sure that's a barnyard dance move, and then we flipped it and laid it on its bottom on a nice thick piece of foam insulation. Just like this. Dun 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 dun. I mean, it's looking pretty darn sexy, don't you think? Can I say sexy in a video? Next, I needed to oil the interior, which meant I had to take my shoes off, because my boat, like that annoying friend's house in high school, is a shoe-free zone. I just really didn't want to get van tread prints all over the inside while I oiled. And then I started the slow and agonizing process of finishing the inside of the boat in every little nook and corner and surface thoroughly coated with oil. I did the front, I did the back, and then I did the middle, hunched over like a weirdo. And not once did I do this, but 4 times until everything was soaked in a beautiful, lustering glow of teak oil. Then when the inside was done, I did the outside. And then I did the outside again, being very careful not to get any oil on my fresh new paint job. Then I walked around and around the boat for about an hour, just making sure I caught all the drips. And pretty soon there was nothing left to do but put it all back together. 3 months ago I started this project. 3 months ago I opened a set of plans that was 60 pages long. 60 pages of instructions to get to this point. A point that, I'm not gonna lie, I sometimes thought I would never reach. But here we are, with just a few things left to do. After installing most of the internal pieces, I still needed to weave the rope around my oarsman's seat. This is a really good way to just get somebody aggravated, because I had to start with about 70 feet of rope, and weaving 70 feet of rope back and forth is just, well, it wasn't fun. But I got it done in the end and was able to reinsert my oarsman's seat back into the boat. Now, I still need to bolt this in place, but I was holding off on doing that until I got everything else just right. After getting my oarsman's seat in, next came the oar blocks. Remember those things? The oar blocks that hold the oar locks. So I slid the oar blocks back into place, I secured them with the original bolts and caps, and I inserted the brass oar locks and cotter pins to hold the oar locks in place. After the oar blocks, just for fun, I inserted my custom-made seat backs. Most of the time, these will reside in that storage compartment in the moving seat, but I just wanted to make everything fancy. And then the most important part, my stainless steel cup holders, because a boat can never have too many cup holders. And with the cup holders in, it was done. It may not be the best boat out there. It may not be perfectly built, or perfectly designed, or perfectly executed, but she's my boat. And, well, I like her. I keep saying her, and you're probably thinking, well, what's her name? A boat has to have a name. Well, that's true, but you'll have to wait for the next video. Of course there's going to be a next video. You didn't think I could get it completely finished and launched in this video, did you? You'll have to stick around for the last and final video, when I slide this thing slowly into the water like an old man getting in a jacuzzi tub.
White snow, red sky, reach up for so high.
Well, here we are. The moment we've all been waiting for. The last and final video where we put this thing in the water.
The boat was complete. There was just one thing left to do. It's bad luck to have a boat without a name on it. So it was time to name this vessel. I wanted a name that was strong, a name that meant something personally to me. And there was only one name that came to mind. A name that embodied, well, everything I love in life. And that name was Verna Louise, my grandmother. Let me tell you a little bit about my grandma. She is 93 years young. She is caring, full of life, and one of the most wonderful people I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. She's a great grandma. No, literally, she's Ivor's great grandma. Here she is on a swing outside my shop.
Hold on! Woo! Jason!
So with that, I christened this vessel the Verna Louise, a woman who has meant more to me in my lifetime than she will ever know. This one's for you, Grandma. I hope I've done you proud. And I hope one day you'll come visit me so you can ride in it. Jeez, why you gotta be in Arizona like every other old person? Anyways, love you, Grandma.
Let me show you my boat.
The Verna Louise is a 16-foot Mackenzie-style drift boat made specifically for the hardy rivers of the Pacific Northwest. Because it's a drift boat, the oarsman is seated forward towards the bow instead of towards the transom. This is so they can see where they're going as they head downriver and guide people on luxurious fishing trips. The ribbing of the boat is made of solid ash grown here in Oregon, and the hull and bottom are made from Akume plywood. She is a good, strong vessel, and I think she will fare me well.
Well, here we are, January 28th, 2021, the year of our Lord. And I christened this vessel, the Verna Louise, ready for her maiden voyage. You didn't think I was gonna waste good scotch, did you?
White snow, red sky, reach up for so high. Blue eyes, fake cry, beware of the fox tonight. Cold feet, a dark rain, my blood in your frozen veins. Dream high, no pain, run fast in the broken chains.
And just like that, the project's complete. It's a little bittersweet, I'm not gonna lie. I'm so thrilled to have accomplished this and have it done and know that it's not gonna sink. But what am I gonna do now? We've got a long year. I'm sure I'll think of something. If you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe down below, like this video, share it with a million of your friends. Check out our podcast, Shop Sounds Podcast. It's a pretty good one. And yeah, check out some of these other videos around here. Good day.